Just thinking.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our LCB webinar. We're going to let some people trickle in and get started in just about 1 minute. We do have over 200 people registered for this webinar today, so we want to make sure as many of them can jump on, and then we'll do introductions and get started.
I'm not going to be able to hear this.
Right. That was the way to give her mic.
Right.
This webinar will be recorded today, so it'll be available after we finish up. And we will also be working on creating a FAQ document to get all of this fun, all these fun answers and questions in writing, so that if you don't have time to sit through and watch us all over again, we'll have a document prepared for you to read these questions and answers later on. Okay, it looks like we're about 75% of the way there with attendees, so I am going to get us started. My name is Katie Doyle, and I'm the State Government Affairs Sorry, I'm not the director, the manager at the Hospitality Association, and I am the lead on all of our alcohol issues. Today, I am joined by Annie McGrath.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. I'm Annie McGrath, and I'm the Executive Director of the Washington Brewers Guild, and we're really excited as we move into phase 2 for everybody to get reopened again. And we're excited to be opening again. We're excited for our restaurant and bar partners to be open again, and we thank you guys for supporting and pouring Washington beer.
We're also joined by Josh McDonald at the Washington Wine Institute.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, I'm Josh McDonald, the Executive Director of the Washington Wine Institute. We're the statewide trade association for the Washington wine industry. We're excited to be partnered here with our colleagues and partners in the hospitality, restaurant, lodging, and brewery industry, as well as our Liquor and Cannabis Board leaders in licensing and enforcement. So we're looking forward to learning today. And also looking forward to working our way towards phase 2 and a safe, thoughtful way to reopen our winery tasting rooms and all the help we can go there with that there. So thank you for having us, and thank you for allowing us to be part of this.
We are also joined by two of the two staffers at the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board, the Chief Enforcement Officer, Justin Nordhorn.
Good morning, everyone. Justin Nordhorn, as she said, Chief of the Enforcement Division. Hopefully we'll be able to answer your questions today.
And we're also joined by Rebecca Smith, who is their licensing director. And with that, we will get started. So a little bit of housekeeping for today. We have developed a list of topics/questions that we will be going through. You have an opportunity in the chat box to answer or ask questions and hopefully get answers throughout the entire presentation. The one request that we have is that you try and keep your questions relevant to the topic at hand. I feel confident that we have a variety of topics and that every question can get answered within that particular topic. But it's easier to answer questions while we're focused on one thing. So that's the only real housekeeping I have. I'll mention again that this will be recorded and available after the broadcast, hopefully by tomorrow. We'll be able to send that back out to you and to any of your colleagues that may have missed today's presentation. And with that, we'll jump right in. The first question for today is in regards to closing your bar seating. So Justin, are there any best practices that the LCB recommends for closing bar seating?
So I think when you're looking at the bar seating situation, there was a little bit of confusion on the proclamation information coming out. So one of the things that we wanted to make very clear is the proclamations when they came out indicated the bar areas. And what we're defining as the bar area is the actual bar seating around where you would have the taps and the back bar and those types of things. So there's going to be a number of restaurants out there that are going to want to extend their dedicated dining area into the restricted area of the bar and have that be part of the dedicated dining. So when we're talking about the bar area, we're talking strictly around the bar stools that surround the bar. So as far as best practices, of course, to limit that access and availability, removing the stools if you can would certainly be of help. But you're also going to want to have some sort of signage up there saying, please don't sit at the bar during phase 2. Please don't stand around the bar. It'd be more operating like a service bar aspect versus a traditional bar. And so you want to be able to educate your customers, but you also want to be able to have something that's easy for them to see that, hey, that the bar stools aren't there. That's going to be easier. If you can't remove those bar stools, you may want to put some sort of a sign on the stool itself saying, closed for seating, something of that nature. So when a patron does walk up there, they can easily identify that, no, this isn't open yet during the phase 2 portion.
Great. I think I will mention also that our actual government affairs director at the Washington Hospitality Association has also joined us today, and she will be monitoring our chat box. Another question we had, I think that relates to this, is if a bar does continue to utilize bar seating, what authority does the LCB have in this scenario, and do they have the authority to revoke a license?
So yes, the authority is there for the corrective action up to including revocation if that were to become necessary. And we have been in communications with other agencies as well as the governor's office on these issues. And there's a real strong interest to maintain the safety measures that have been put forward by the governor. And so we're being asked to go out and ensure that there's going to be compliance. Now, what we've done so far is with the complaints coming in on social distancing or bars and restaurants not adhering to some of these areas, we've provided a lot of education, and that's really what we want to do is gain that voluntary compliance. However, as the phasing begins here and we're going to have phase 2 openings, if people are not complying and the bars and restaurants are not going to be complying with those safety conditions, we've been asked to make sure that we're escalating those corrective notices to make sure that compliance is achieved. And so that's something that we're going to be trying to work with people on. Of course, we're trying to educate first and make sure people have a full understanding of what the impacts are. But if we do have places that are just going to open up and disregard the governor's proclamations, you can expect our enforcement officers to address those issues as consistently as we can across the state.
Can I ask a follow-up question on the bar? Because I know we've had some questions from members that have looked at any ways that they might be able to utilize that bar area. For phase 2, is the bar just off limits completely, or is there anything anyone can do to install like a plexiglass screen there to close it off so there aren't employees working behind it and it's more of a tabletop, or is the bar area just off limits for phase 2?
So for patrons, the bar area where people would be sitting at the bar is off limits for phase 2. It does open up a little bit in phase 3, but that seating area around the bar has to be shut off for patron engagement during the phase 2 portion. If you're talking about in the restaurants on the restricted areas, we're going to be putting out information, basically declassifying lounges for the period of time until later phasing, so we don't have to go through approvals of every restaurant out there to declassify for a short period. So we're going to provide a blanket approval to be moving the dedicated dining space into those restricted areas. And what we want to do is provide a written notification. It'll be on our website for everybody to have. I would recommend posting that next to the license, having it available. So if local law enforcement were to come in and they didn't understand some of the changes that were made, they'd have something tangible to look at. You could say, hey, no, this area is open to all ages at this particular point. One of the things to keep in mind as we go through the phasing and the bars reopen, the bar areas, and you start being able to have patrons around there, minors will never be allowed to be at the bar counter. So that prohibition will continue throughout the entire phasing on the reopening.
Thank you.
Hey, Justin, question for probably some of us, even in the restaurant, that may go appointment only, but I know as our wineries, a lot of our wineries are thinking about appointment only as a beginning to help with control of the environment and sort of safely opening in a way that we can get our arms around how to do this successfully. If you're in a appointment only, so you're not open to the public in that sense, are you the use of the bar area change because you're not having that, you only have one party in there at a time, for example, so you're only interacting with one 5 group or under group, and so does that change the dynamic of the use of the bar?
No, not according to the proclamation information that's out there. So with the phase 2, the bar area is completely off limits regardless of how many patrons are in the establishment. And if it's by appointment only, it wouldn't change that particular dynamic. So what we would be looking at is making sure that there's people in the seating area, that you don't have more to the table than the capacity allowances in the proclamations as the phasing continues, and that, of course, that those tables are separated. So the bar area will be off limits until phase 3 begins, is when I think that we are at the point of allowing 25% occupancy at that particular location.
And so thank you, Justin. A little follow up to that. If we set up 6 feet away from the bar and spaced out properly, that's acceptable, correct? As long as you're safely socially distanced from the bar area, tables or standing or whatnot.
Yeah, if you're having the tables are 6 feet away from the bar and people are sitting there with, I think in the phase 2, no more than groups of 5 at those tables, then you would be okay. Just no seating at the bar itself.
And thank you. And finally, do you recommend to wineries that we consider things like pre-pouring samples, having everything prepared so there's minimizing contact there, or as well as the amount of times a customer and an employee interacts?
Yeah, those types of things are really business decisions. And when you're talking about mitigating the risk of contact exposures, you're going to have to be looking at that. One of the things that we struggle with is making sure that restaurants in particular can adhere to some of the other requirements, especially around TTB. Now, as a manufacturer, you're going to be able to have a little latitude on the pouring of issues, but like pre-mixed drinks for the day, those types of things, we're saying, yeah, we're not going to be doing any enforcement around that right now, but we don't want to see those carry out from overnight, and then you have the fermentation start happening. So if you make a batch a week before, and then you're almost into this manufacturing mode. Now, as a manufacturer, you're going to be able to have some more opportunities to have those samples set up, but it's really dependent on the volume of customers you're going to have, how much you're going to want to have out in the open. So those really are going to be business decisions. But if you can minimize and limit those contacts for folks, that's going to really help with the public health aspects of this.
Thank you.
Julia, were there any questions in the chat regarding bar seating that did not get addressed?
Yeah, there is a couple questions. I think we need a clarification regarding the bar versus counter seating. So if a counter is not, I guess the other side, a service bar where you're pouring drinks, is that seating allowed, or is that considered a bar? So again, a counter sort of maybe facing a wall, is that considered a bar, or is that seating allowed?
So basically what I would be looking at, and I don't believe that we have absolute clarity in that particular area, but if you have your wells, your taps, your back bar all set up around, and then your bar seating encloses that particular area, that would be considered a bar. If you have just a buddy bar, essentially that's a standalone table that's off, kind of like what Josh had mentioned, that would be acceptable. If you have a lunch counter, those aren't really covered in the proclamation. So if you think about some of your chain restaurants that have that lunch counter area, you would still need to make sure that there are people social distancing 6 feet apart. Now, that doesn't necessarily line up. I would recommend closing those areas off just in the spirit of the governor's proclamation based on the social distancing issues, because the bar counters aren't 6 feet away necessarily from the people who have to work behind those counters. And so your patrons that are sitting at a lunch counter, may be closer than what's necessary, and protecting the employees is really important. So I would recommend closing those off to patrons. And I know that folks are in different situations, but if it has a well and taps and those types of things that we normally consider a bar area, those would have to remain off limits.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. Another question we got, Justin, about the notice provided by the Liquor and Cannabis Board. When would that be available to print and post?
So we have a whole bunch of the advisements already on our website. We're hoping to have many of these finalized that we're in the process. So we have a 10 a.m. Policy meeting pretty much daily that we cover these things, and then we try to do some fine tuning. And we have to make sure that some of these are, we run them through our AG's office as well, just to get some feedback, and so they can identify any guidance that they want us to consider. Obviously, the decision is that of the LCB. So we have a vetting process essentially that we go through. So once those are all completed, that's when we try to get them posted. And we have most of the stuff posted already, but there are a few that are still to be posted. And hopefully by I don't want to commit us because I don't manage that particular area, but we're hoping that we can get those up in short order that are pending by the end of the week, I would say, to make sure that everything's in place as phase 2 opens. We have some businesses opening, especially in Eastern Washington and some of those counties that are phase 2. So it's really, we understand the importance of getting those things posted so people can print them out and have them available for their staff education, as well as anybody who wants to see that if local law enforcement comes in, fire marshal, somebody like that.
Great.
And that's about all the questions we've gotten on this topic.
Thank you, Julia. The next question we have is, what is the process if a licensee would like to make a temporary or permanent modification to their current floor plan? So in this instance, Justin, talking about operators that maybe have a lounge space that they're now considering, you're saying that it's fine that they use that for minors for now and that there'll be a temporary allowance. What is the process? And maybe this would be better for Becky to answer if they decide that they would like to make those changes permanent. And obviously, feel free to touch on all of the temporary issues as well.
Sure, I'll start with the temporary, and then I'll kick it over to Becky for the process on the permanent. Realizing that we're going to have a number of people wanting to do temporary adjustments, quite frankly, our capacity isn't that robust that we could be able to process those in a very timely manner when you're talking about potentially 3 weeks between each phase. And so what we're trying to do is make this as accessible for folks as possible. So if it's just a temporary fix, if it's an outdoor dining area issue, if it's moving your dedicated dining into your lounge space, we're trying to provide some blanket approvals up front so you can temporarily adjust and modify those business practices as it goes forward. Without having to get formal approval from the board for every change. Now, any temporary change, and one of the dates to keep in mind is when phase 4 starts and people are able to open up completely, those temporary modifications then go away. And so that's really going to be a key date for folks to remember on rolling back some of those adjustments and modifications that we've had those allowances in place. So, it looks like Becky was having some technical challenges. I think I just saw that her call just dropped off. So as far as I'll try to touch the bases as best I can on permanent issues here. With regard to permanent adjustments, if you want to make some changes permanently, of course, there's a process. You're going to send that through the licensing division for approval. So what that's going to mean is if you're expanding dedicated dining into a restricted area that's going to be further, you're going to be moving barriers, you're going to be moving the demarcations, you're going to be expanding an outdoor area. Those are the types of things, if it's on a permanent basis, that need to go through licensing. Some of the advisements that we provided are not necessarily going to be permanent because they would require statutory change. And we're going to get to some of those questions in a little bit. But if you're doing floor space alterations, you can go ahead and do the permanent alterations request as normal through the licensing division, and they'll be able to process those for approvals. If you're trying to change something, and one of the things that we've heard, some folks want to change license classes to be able to adapt to these changing times. And so if that's the case, then those are certainly permanent approvals that need to go through the process. And we would encourage you to apply through the licensing division. Just the temporary issues don't need that formal approval. Becky was just able to join us again. So I'm going to put this over to Becky for any of the processes identified on the permanent changes that she wants to cover.
Just wait. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Computer problems, my challenge these days. So I'm hoping that where you left off was what was required if they wanted to have a floor plan modification. And if it's temporary, I think you covered that, Justin. There's no requirements at all. If it's something that a licensee wants to do permanently, it's the regular process. You want to submit it to liquor alterations at lcb.wa.gov. If you have questions about that, don't hesitate to give us a call, whether you give Beth Lehman a call or just our customer service line. Someone will pick up. As far as the processing time, with all of the special occasion requests that have been refunded, that we're looking at the processing time even being less. Right now, it's about 7 to 14 days is our usual processing time for alterations. So we're hoping that it'll take less than 7 days.
Thank you, Becky.
And is there a difference between making changes to the indoor floor plan temporarily versus extending outdoor service temporarily, or are there no approvals required for either of those modifications?
So great question, Annie. So for indoor seating for temporary, there are no there's no requirements to submit any type of an alterations requests. For outdoor seating, the same would be true if you were moving tables around, but if you're planning on extending the area, or actually if you don't have a current area outside and you want to have a seating area outside, we'd ask that you go ahead and submit an alterations request. Again, if it's about moving the tables, but if it's about extending that outdoor area, then we would make that request.
Okay, thank you, Becky.
Either for Becky or Justin, if you're trying to extend out specifically onto a sidewalk and you haven't done that before, can you touch base on kind of how that process works? And to my understanding, there's some level of interaction with the city on that, and maybe other agencies. So could you touch a little bit on how that works?
Certainly. So if you're making a request for outdoor seating where a city needs to be involved, you definitely want to reach right out to your city first to find out what their requirements are. That, again, ours are a bit easier. You just need to put in that alteration request for outdoor seating. But if you want the sidewalk, you really should talk to the city first, or if you want it out in a street area, you need to talk to the city first.
Great, thank you. A couple other things real quick. One, can you touch on the 42-inch barrier requirement? Is it fair to say that it's not needed to be permanent in the sense of bolted to the ground, but it just needs to be 42 inches and help with control? Or can you touch a little bit on that?
Yeah. So it doesn't have to be permanent. Right now, that if it's a 42-inch barrier, that we would request that you could have planters or some type of extension so folks can see where it begins and where it ends. That we're not requiring that it be bolted into the ground, that it be the turtles that some folks have and at their outdoor seating areas. All of that would be permanent.
And great, thank you. And finally, for my wineries, quick question. We've talked about this in past seminars. Could you touch on The picnic area we're allowed adjacent to our winery space, our production space, and taste room space. It's something that our wineries could think about as an outdoor, encouraging outdoor use during the summer, and be able to utilize that more than indoor.
Certainly. Again, I would strongly suggest if it's a new area that they're using in the wineries for an outdoor picnic area, that they put in, give us a call. They put in an alterations request. But again, give us a call. Let us have a conversation about what the wineries are talking about the areas that they want to use for picnicking and outdoor service. If it's something that they've never done before, we want to help walk them through the process. If it's just an extension of the area, we probably just want to have them send some pictures in so we can see and make sure that we've scanned them into their file as well.
So a couple of points that I would point out on those outdoor areas. So the easiest way for us to get you through the process, whether it's going to be a request or to have the questions answered, is if the outdoor area is contiguous and adjacent, makes it much easier for us to the licensed business. Making sure that you have leasehold rights over those particular areas. So if you don't have the right to go into that area because somebody else owns it, then that could be problematic for you. And then the other area that you may want to talk to is your local fire department, because my understanding, and I'm not an expert in this area, but my understanding is that you have an interior occupancy limit, but you also have an exterior occupancy limit for those dedicated outdoor spaces. And so if you are getting a larger space, you may want to talk to the fire department so you understand what that occupancy limit is, because in the phasings, for example, on phase 2, you can only have 50% of your occupancy limit. So if you are expanding, that doesn't mean that you get to use 100% occupancy unless that occupancy then gets changed. So there's a little confusion about that out there, and I'd really encourage folks to talk to the local fire departments about if there's a way to get a temporary increase in the occupancy based on the expansion of the area and whether or not that's viable for them. Because what we don't want to do is put you all in a situation where we're saying, yeah, you can go out and expand your outdoor dining area to be able to do A, B, and C, and then local jurisdictions come in and say, no, you can't really do that. So make sure that you're working on both fronts to make sure that that compliance is reached, so you're not finding yourself in a difficult spot.
Hey, Katie, before we move, well, we may have already moved on to outdoor seating, but we do have a couple additional questions regarding floor plan modifications. Is this a good time to get those answered before we move on to outdoor seating?
Fantastic time.
Okay, so there's a question regarding the move to the temporary allowance of lounge areas. How does that impact the concealed pistol license holders? So the bar area that is restricted to guns in an establishment, is that impacted or changed at all?
So there will be an impact to that, because what we're planning on doing is coming out and just declassifying those particular areas. And the reason being is if we don't, and you have, let's say a family comes in and you have them sitting in the restricted area that's now a temporarily extended dedicated dining area, if we don't change that formal classification, that youth that's in that particular area could be subject to contact and those types of things by local law enforcement who's used to that area being a restricted area. So in order to provide that clarity, we want to be able just to come out and say, okay, we're declassifying these areas. Because of that declassification, that area would be treated just like a dedicated dining area and not a restricted area, meaning that as far as the concealed pistol carry goes, if you have a permit, they would be able to take that into the dedicated dining area, even though that they couldn't have taken it into the restricted area. So when the phasing continues to open and you start having that bar seating, that will still be considered a restricted area at the bar. So when you're looking at, can somebody come in with a concealed weapon, carrying a concealed weapon with a permit? Can they sit at the bar? the answer is still no, because the firearms laws don't allow for that in that particular area. But the dedicated dining area that's getting declassified, they would actually have legal ability to do that with the blanket declassification that we're proposing to do.
Great, thank you. And then I think on the same note here, if an establishment had no barriers, or the entire establishment is has excluded minors, does the temporary declassification allow that establishment to serve families and folks of all ages now?
So no, that the declassification is going to be for those locations that have just the restaurant with a lounge. If you're 100% off limits to minors, you would have to get that reclassified through licensing. That's a little trickier for us to deal with on the legal front, similar to taverns and the like. So if you're classified as off limits to minors at all times, that would have to be something that we would want to see a different approval for. So we're allowing that in. So that might be something we need to have further discussion on. But at this point in time, what our focus is those restaurants that have a lounge and be able to bleed over into the lounge area.
Great. And then is there any limitation or requirement on the temporary use of production space for tasting, like the clearing out of a barrel room for seating and tables to facilitate the distancing? Could that space be repurposed as well?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I think that would have a similar look and feel to what we're talking about. And so trying to be as flexible as we can for folks, I think that would be an amenable approach. What we want to make sure again, though, is we're taking a look at some of the occupancy issues. So if you're saying that we have a occupancy limit in our facility that is 50, in phase 2, it has to only be 25. And so that doesn't mean that you could expand into an area and then have 50 still. So you still have that occupancy issue based on the governor's proclamation to juggle in figuring out if this is the best thing for your business or not.
Great. And then just to be crystal clear before we move on to the next topic, with the temporary declassification of lounge space, those tables and seating areas can be utilized for serving folks under the age of 21. Is that correct?
That's correct. So once we have that classification out, those people under 21 would be legal to go into those areas.
Great. Next slide. So we did touch on this. What I heard, Justin, was that if you are moving tables around in your outdoor space, currently you're fine, don't need to contact the LCB. But if you're looking to expand onto a sidewalk, have a picnic area, that kind of thing, it's important that you not only contact the LCB and let them know about the modification to your outdoor dining, but that you also are considering contacting the fire department for occupancy issues, and also looking to contact the city if you're going on the sidewalk specifically.
That's correct. So what we're looking at is we're not necessarily, and Becky, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're all on the same page, but we're not asking for temporary expansions. So if you're changing your outdoor seating area and you're going to expand it within your leasehold rights already, we're not saying you have to go through a big formal process to be able to do that before you can serve out there. But if you're going into other areas, you have to make sure you have leasehold rights, and you want to also talk to local jurisdictions about occupancy issues, so you're not finding yourself in conflict with any local jurisdictional or ordinance issues.
Great. And Julia, were there any outdoor specific questions that we didn't touch on yet?
I think we've covered all of them.
Great. So our next question is, what, if any, changes are being made to the rules that were previously enforced, but the LCB is currently relaxing during this crisis? So things like menu requirements, hours of service. Can you touch on some of those items, Justin?
Yeah, so what we're talking with our staff about, and we want to be able to outline that we're not going to be doing strict enforcement around some of the regulatory issues that we've had around number of meals, hours of day. We recognize that people, as you are opening up your businesses again, you may not be at full capacity. You may not have the capital to be open 5 days a week. Maybe you can only be open for the 3 days on the weekend to start with. You may not have the menu items available. If we have a supply chain issue, let's say with meat, as we're seeing across the country, you may have 8 menu items, but you can only fulfill 4 of them because you don't have access to the ingredients for the other ones. So what we're doing is we're not going to be enforcing the minimum number of meals so long as full meals are available. So we're not going to come out and necessarily say, here's the number, but you have to be operating as a bona fide restaurant, and you have to be providing full meals. And if you don't have any full meals, then that may be an issue. But as long as you're providing full meals, we're not going to be coming in and taking a look at those items. And you may be doing also a lot of menu switches depending on the type of food you can get in through the supply chain. And I know the governor's asking everybody to have disposable menus and those types of things. So you may be changing those on a frequent basis. We're not going to be approving menus if you're making those modifications. Again, we're just asking businesses to be in compliance with having the full meals available. You don't have to have the 8 meals. We're not going to be enforcing that. We're not going to be saying that you have to be open for a minimum of 5 hours a day for complete meal service, or that you have to be open a minimum of 5 days a week for those licensees that have those requirements. So we recognize we want to provide as much flexibility to the licensees to get up and running in a safe manner as possible. One of the things we didn't discuss amending was minimum food service. So I would anticipate that if you are open and you're not providing, you may have provided complete meals for your 5 hours, and then after that you're just going to be open for a couple hours. If you're providing any alcohol sales and service, you'll need to have at least that minimum food service that is there for the spirits, beer, and wine restaurant. So we didn't look about modifying the minimum food service issues in those areas. That could come up in conversation. I'm not saying it won't, but that's something that we haven't talked about at this point. But what we have talked about is relaxing our approach on hours of operation, days of the week, and number of complete meals.
Great. How long should we expect these temporary policies to exist, specifically in regards to relaxed enforcement?
So at least up to the beginning of phase 4, and we've talked about extending that for a period of time after that to allow people to kind of get back into the full swing of things. So the general rule that we're looking at here is if it is an RCW that dictates that requirement, that will most likely be rolled back right at the beginning of phase 4. And we're still working on the timelines on some of those, because we actually don't have the legal authority to say you can't or that you can operate in violation of those RCWs. Those are policy decisions that the legislature needs to be able to make. If it's by rule, we can certainly relax those a little bit more easily, and that's what we're trying to focus on, is which are in rule, which is in law, and where can those types of accommodations be. We looked at doing some extensions beyond when the proclamation gets lifted, and we're probably talking either a 30-day period, maybe a 60-day period. I think that the last I heard was resting back on a 30-day after everything is done, just so everybody has a specific date and people can make plans to roll things back. So it's not just here's a flip the switch and that's done. The areas that will be more of the immediate rollback are spirits to go, and I think you're going to be asking some questions about that from the spirits, beer, and wine restaurants. That is not an allowance that's currently in RCW. So once phase 4 opens, people should expect that process to discontinue.
Thank you. On enforcement, if an enforcement officer comes into my establishment, what kind of interaction should I expect at this time now that things have changed so rapidly?
Well, I think one of the things that you can expect is if you have a large crowd. Sometimes the officer may go in depending on their comfort level, but they may actually call you and say, hey, can I talk to the licensee outside? So they don't have to get into the large crowds and we can still deal with a potential concern. Let's say in phase 2, we can see that the entire establishment is full. They may be calling in, and if they don't get anybody, then of course they'll go in. We've instructed the officers to provide a lot of education to make sure that people fully understand what these issues are. But we will be looking for compliance, and if folks are refusing to comply, or they're saying, yeah, I'll comply, but then they don't follow through with that, then they could expect escalation in corrective notices from our staff. But as always, you should expect our staff to be approachable. You should expect our staff to be professional and courteous at all times. And they may be coming in and just asking some questions about how your business is operating, because we have so many temporary allowances. It's just to get their knowledge up to speed on, okay, what's going on, because they are also a conduit between local governments as well. So we may be getting those questions, and if we have the answers for other folks asking, then it makes it easier to explain that, and hopefully less burdensome on the licensee to have multiple people continuing to come in and asking the same questions. Not that that won't happen, but if we're exploring that, I would say, don't take that as, oh my gosh, we're being questioned about everything we're doing. We're just trying to gain some knowledge so we can help out as well.
Thank you. Amy or Josh, did you have any specific questions regarding enforcement for your specific industries?
I've got a question about expired beer that, I think is a really heartbreaking issue for some of us, because we hate seeing all of this good beer go to waste. But what are some of the options available to retailers that might have some expiring kegs, whether those have been tapped or untapped? And what's the process for breweries to destroy that expired beer and collect paid excise beer taxes on it?
Sure. So there's some forms out there. We worked with our finance division and got some clarification on that. So if you have aged beer or aged out beer and you need to destroy that, you can apply for that tax credit. There are some standard forms for when you're doing the beer destruction. You'd mark off the destruction listing and be able to submit that for that particular tax issue. As far as once a keg is tapped, the distributors are probably not going to provide a replacement for that. Now, if you tap a keg, of course, and it's within the first 8 days, and you're like, hey, this is bad beer, then there's already allowances in the laws and rules that you can exchange that and have that swapped out. But if it's been tapped for several weeks and then it goes bad, that's where the distributors are most likely not going to provide a refund. And I know that we've worked with the distributors and a lot of the retailers on trying to get some of that product out of the marketplace for those who weren't going to be able to sell it, so they can get it into those areas that could sell it. So hopefully what we provided on some of those return allowances help mitigate these issues as they're moving forward. There are some other issues that we've seen where people have taken some of the aged product for destruction, and I can't say that I understand the entire process of how to make this, but I know that people have been using some of the beer product even as converting to other manufacturers and distillers to make it into hand sanitizer. So there's some options, and what we've allowed there is also the tax credit, because it is a destruction issue. It's not being consumed. It's being just modified into something that's not a consumable tax in the same way as regular beer. So those are some options on there. If you're going to be basically destroying anything over about 200 cases, you should be contacting your local officer and making sure that everything is lined up so questions can be answered beforehand and we have an understanding. So if anything needs to be addressed, we can provide that information and help out where we can. And that's also established in the rules right now. So if there's something more specific that I can try to answer, I can try to tackle that. But that's kind of the general gist. And we do want to make sure that people that have out-of-date product can move that off the shelves. The issue that I would ask folks to consider, and this isn't an LCB ask, this is just trying to be a good partner with our industry members, is if they have a lot of full kegs, or partial kegs, I should say, it's a lot to destroy for the distributors and trying to figure that out. So if you have, an eighth of a keg left, they would prefer to see that be returned empty and have you deal with the destruction issues. But keep in mind also, there are, environmental impacts. There's probably regulatory codes around agriculture and EPA and Department of Ecology and the like on product destruction. So, keep all of those things in mind. But I know that as far as logistics, the return of a lot of product can be overwhelming for the distributors.
Great. Thank you, Justin.
Julia, are there any enforcement specific questions that we haven't touched on in this particular area?
We've covered everything in this area, but we did generate a lot of questions about outdoor occupancy that I want to just go back and touch on real quickly. So if you have a patio or a deck or a balcony or an actual structure that is connected to the building, that would have an occupancy limit that the fire department controls. If we're talking about a park, well, not a park, but maybe a field or a grassy area or a parking lot or et cetera, that is outdoors, that does not have an occupancy limit. So I just wanted to clarify there, when we're talking about outdoor space, it's an actual structure that the fire code would have occupancy limit on. And then we are getting a lot of questions, not related to liquor licensing, but about how to count occupancy, how to sanitize menus, how to sanitize items that are tabletop. And I just wanted to point out to the folks on this webinar that the Hospitality Association did host a webinar just like this with the Health Department and Labor and Industries that went over a number of those items in detail. Those are that webinar and sections of that webinar are posted on our website and available for anyone to watch. It's not a requirement. A membership is not a requirement to watch those.
Thank you. And Matt's going to add that those links to the chat box so everyone does have access to those resources right here, right now. Well, with that, we'll move on to our next topic, and that is alcohol to go. So as you all know, currently operators can sell beer, wine, spirits, and cocktails to go. And I know Justin already knows that everyone's wondering how long this will be in effect. I think you did touch on this, but if you could just go over it one more time, and then maybe also touch on what the path forward would look like to make this a permanent option for our operators.
Sure. So one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to analyze all of the accommodations that we've conducted and afforded, whether it was a rule issue or a law issue. The rule issues, we're going to catalog and visit that from a policy standpoint internally. And if we can adjust things by rule, then those conversations can happen. Of course, we want these type of changes to be vetted through the public process and public comment through rulemaking. So just because they're an allowance right now doesn't mean it would be automatically transitioned if it was a rule change, because there are some other competing interests that we've received that aren't necessarily in favor of all of the allowances that we've made. If it is a law issue such as the spirits to go, then that process moving forward would have to be a legislative ask and a legislative change. And so that's something that the board is not necessarily in a legal position to modify or adjust. And so we're trying to catalog all of those issues. As far as the operator selling beer, wine, and spirits to go, I mentioned before that you can anticipate once everything is fully open that the spirits to go issues are going to have to subside. The areas that we're looking at trying to make some adjustments on are around the beer and wine issues. So there's a lot of privileges out there, even for, let's say, the spirits, beer, and wine licenses, where you can sell a growler, let's say, to go. And then the question is, well, if I can sell a growler, why can't I sell, a packaged beer to go? And that's something that we're looking at from a rule standpoint. So if the privilege is already there, that's something that we're trying to see. Is that just a rule change, or would that actually require a legislation to modify that approach? And so what we can expect is, as this moves forward, going into phase 4 or a short period thereafter, what we'll be looking at is rolling back most of those temporary accommodations. And we're going to be assessing, obviously, what those look like against the public safety impacts that are out there and what makes sense. Obviously, even when phase 4 opens up, that doesn't mean, hey, green light, everything's back to normal. We understand that there's going to be a lot of different issues. We understand that there's risk coming up, potentially even in the fall with a resurgence. And so we want to be well positioned to be able to adapt and help businesses out as best as we can.
We appreciate that. Any other questions on this particular topic from Julia, Annie, or Josh?
So Justin, on the wine side, our thank you for the ability, our curbside, our home delivery, those kind of things, those all play into this as far as continuing to allow wineries to do this through at least phase 4. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, so once phase 4 starts, that's where we're going to have to look. Well, so I guess at least through phase 3, and then we'll be looking at, once phase 4 starts, is there going to be an end date on some of those issues? And that's what we're looking at. We're trying to catalog. So, and we'll be reaching out to folks too in the periods between now and then to say, here's what we're thinking about, and having those dialogues with the industry members.
Thank you. I think we can move into our final slide, which is just going to be an opportunity to capture all the questions that you maybe haven't received an answer to, or maybe are sitting in the chat that Julia is just so excited to share those questions.
So I have one, and then I'll jump on real quick if that's all right. And then that I got about samples as we start to interact with our restaurant and other partners as we move into the next phases. So real quick, Justin and Becky, how do we handle getting samples to retail chain buyers for them to taste, review, and hopefully put in distribution for a supplier? You currently can't get samples from a distributor's warehouse. Most buyers are working from home. So simple question is, can I purchase samples of new items and send it to the buyer's home? Or how do I handle that so we can start interacting with our partners and getting our wine into their retail chain again, making sure they want it, and then going from there?
So if I understand this right, you're asking about how a winery essentially can provide the sample to a retail licensee, and since they're not in the business, to send it to their home. Am I hearing that?
So we can have that interaction with them. Right now, they're not typically in their business for obvious reasons, but we want to start talking again about getting our wine into the on-premise accounts, and how we have that interaction in a way that is legal and acceptable.
Okay. And I don't know if I'll have a good answer for you today, but I can take that back. And I'm trying to think, if businesses are open, then obviously that avenue is there. And do you know how much, what level of challenge that you're having with that because people are at home?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I think as we transition to phase 2, it's going to change for us a little bit, but not everyone will be working from the restaurant, for example. And we're just trying to get us, but I'll take this offline with you, Justin. But I think that kind of working our way through, so we as wineries understand how to appropriately handle that as we move through the phases, and if there's any ways to make sure we're doing it right, but also if there's flexibility in there as well.
Okay.
Julia, are there any other questions that you feel are vital to today?
Yeah, so we've gotten Can we offer single-person cabaret-style entertainment during phase 2, provided you abide by the social distancing requirements?
Wow. That is not covered in the proclamation information, is it? So the reasonability thought line here is, if you look at the license types, restaurants and taverns are allowed to be open in phase 2 at a limited capacity. However, nightclubs and other venues that are larger with entertainment are not. So I would, I don't think there's a clear answer for that particular question yet, but if I was erring on the side of caution, I would say I wouldn't have a strolling musician going through the establishment. But if there's social distancing going on, is it all that much different than a server walking through the course of the restaurant? Maybe not. So I think that'll take some thought, and it's a kind of a risk issue because, you know, are they going to be 6 feet apart? And keep in mind, one of the things that I think that we've seen at least in the news media, when you think through the public health issues, and I think and I can't say that this is why the thought pattern is also that nightclubs are on the back end, but when you're talking about the environments that are typical to those types of licenses with entertainment, the entertainer is usually singing louder. There's a lot more voice issues, which means that there's a potential spread that's beyond just a normal conversation when you're talking about exhaling. And there's the likelihood that the entertainer who's strolling around is going to be wearing a mask and those types of public health considerations. So, you know, I'm not going to say they can't do that because I think we'd have to kind of vet that further. But from a public health lens, I would be cautious with that.
Thank you.
All right. So then we have another question. So will wineries be available to pour flights or samples for a wine table side using the same bottle to service multiple groups of people?
So explain that a little bit. Are you talking about leaving, having a bottle of wine at one table and then picking it up and going to another table?
So let me jump in real quick. I think that this may be a situation where they're asking, so if we, and again, I apologize for the person who asked. If I don't get it exactly correct, I will happily take this offline with you. But if wineries are taking, so they have a bottle of wine, they're going tableside to pour flights real quick, can they take that same bottle, even though they're the only one touching it? I think this is what I'm being asked. To go to the next table, pour a flight, and the next table. But to my understanding, I think the question is the employee still only one holding the bottle.
So from a health exposure aspect, I don't think that would be a problem. I think where you could have some increased risk, and I would recommend not doing it, is if you have somebody who has had a glass in front of them, they've drank out of it, now they're getting another sample, and you're using that bottle to go from those glasses. Because if the server accidentally touches the glass with that, you could actually have some concern around that. Not that it's an automatic exposure issue, but so I think if you're talking about fresh stemware, that's one thing. If you're talking about repeat use, then you may want to consider from a public health side. As far as the legal issues from LCB, I don't see that as being a legal issue for folks, just from the health side of things, to consider how much exposure and how much consumption has been done from those glasses beforehand.
Thank you.
Is there any type of curfew imposed for service? Do hours of operation need to be changed for phase 2?
Just a standard. There can't be any alcohol sales or service between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. Other than that, we don't have any modifications around that. So folks can utilize the flexibility in that particular normal time range.
And related to-go containers for, I believe, cocktails, are disposable bag style containers permitted for single to-go drinks provided that they don't have straw holes?
Are you talking about like a heat sealed bag? I saw one of those this morning. If it's, when I think about a disposable bag, if you're talking about a Ziploc baggie, that wouldn't be necessarily something we would want to deem as a viable article to be sending out mixed drinks in. If you have a picture, we'd be happy to look at that and let you know. I did get a photo this morning of somebody who wanted to do a heat sealed bag. Basically, they heat seal everything in it, so it has to be torn open or using a scissors when they get home, and I didn't have any issues with that. So I think there's some creativity going on that's certainly within the limits, but what we wouldn't want to see is something that's easily accessible in that vehicle as well.
Okay, and then we've seen other states reduce the quantity of wines they're able to offer in a tasting room setting. Will operators need to reduce tasting lineup or not offer glasses on site?
So we haven't had that as part of our discussion, and I don't see the offerings being limited. It's just the number of people and the space considerations for social distancing is what we're concerned about.
Okay, and then I think we still have a clarification needed. Please clarify if we need to provide fresh stemware between flight samples. We routinely sample 8 wines in a flight, and dishwashing capacity will become a concern.
So again, from an LCB legal standpoint, I don't see that that's a legal issue for you. I think that from a public health standpoint, it potentially has some risk in there, and that might be a good question to ask the health department on how they view that particular issue. So from LCB rules and regulations, I don't have any concern about that type of a thing from that legal standpoint of sales and service. But from the health side, you may want to talk to public health about that issue.
Hey, Justin, do you know if occupancy limits, the 50%, does that include, I assume it does, but does that include both customer and employee? You're talking about who's in the building?
Yeah, I think the occupancy is for the entire building. And so if you have your sections of the building, if they have different occupancy areas, so let's say your dining area has an established occupancy and then your back rooms for kitchen or whatever have something different, then you would treat those differently. And of course, what we're looking at is making sure that social distancing issue is there. So that's the primary concern in the lens that we're going to be looking at. So if your occupancy is 50 and you're supposed to be at 25 and you have 2 people in the back at 27, does that mean that you're going to have an escalation automatically? No. But at the same time, what we're looking at is if you have too many customers that are out front, that could be problematic.
And I'll just jump in here to clarify the occupancy applies to only guest limits. It does not include staff counts.
Thank you. I wasn't quite sure if that was all encompassing, so that makes sense.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, and just to further clarify on that one too, and maybe our friends at the Hospitality Association can help us out with this one. I believe the proclamation and the requirements relate to dine-in capacity. And so how is that impacted by any to-go orders that you might be fulfilling at that time? Is it 50, guest occupancy is 50% for dine-in? And so we take our full max occupancy, cut it in half, and that's how many people we can have seated dining in the establishment according to all of the social distancing standards, of course.
Yeah, so again, I think when you're looking at it from some of the reasonability standpoints, that's going to come into play. And if you're at your occupancy and you have somebody walk in and pick up their meal and drink and take it to go, that's not going to be an issue for us. What would be an issue is if somebody comes in and orders, now they're going to sit down and wait for their meal, even though that they're not eating and dining there. If you have 10 people sitting in line waiting for the meal, that's going to go against the occupancy limit. So, if people are coming in, I'd say, hey, if you're just ordering here at the restaurant, if you have a pager system that they can go sit in the car, texting or something like that. That way you don't have a lot of congregation occurring within the establishment. That's going to be probably your better practice to use.
Great. Thank you. That's helpful, Justin.
So breweries are allowed to pour up to 25% guest beers. Does that rule stay in effect during this time?
Yes, I don't see any issues that we've talked about. Becky, do you recall any issues on that one?
And Becky, you might need to unmute.
I don't recall any issues, Justin.
Yeah, I didn't think we had talked about that that issue either, but I haven't attended 100% of those meetings. So yeah, I don't think that should be an issue for us.
And also, you guys recently provided a clarification on the 25% guest tap rule for us, that applies to packaged beer as well. So it doesn't have to be draft only as some people had interpreted in the past.
That's correct. Yeah, we just provided an advisement on that, that we will consider those as SKUs and they go against what you have on tap. So not what you produce overall. So if you have 16 products that you're producing overall, but you only have 4 of those on tap, it goes against what you have on tap, not your overall portfolio.
Could you touch on live music real quick in phase 2 and 3 from the LCB side? Do you have any opinion on that, or how you would look at that from an enforcement or licensing standpoint?
So again, that kind of comes back to that strolling musician issue. We don't really have a lot of clarification on what that should look like, because most of the entertainment that's live entertainment type of venues are not slated until phase 4. I would probably recommend against engaging in that. That will likely obviously draw in more crowds. It may be more difficult to manage the capacity issues that you have in there. They would be out in your area. So I would also consider space issues, and then what type of exposure risk that type of activity would bring. I wish I could give you a better answer, but it's kind of a nebulous area that's unknown. Again, I know that some of those come into alteration request issues on how people have their space set up. You haven't heard of any of those issues, Becky, have you?
I haven't, but I would also caution against having any type of live entertainment. That comes in phase 4, and that the nightclubs aren't even able to be open right now. So I would really be cautious about having any type of live entertainment in phase 2.
Thank you.
Any other pressing questions before we?
Yeah, I just got another question popped in. Do wine tasting notes need to be disposable or single use?
I don't believe so. We didn't have that as any type of conversation. So on those types of issues, we haven't seen it. But now, if you're talking about those being similar to the menus, I would recommend doing that. Or, depending on, a lot of times folks may have it in, tasting rooms. You could end up having something in a common location that people aren't actually handling. But if the customers are handling stuff and they're going to pass it to the next customer, then I would say that they should probably be disposable based on the intent of the proclamation.
Thank you.
Great, Katie. That sums up the questions in the chat.
Perfect. Well, we really appreciate everyone joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, this will be available to view later on. I would guess tomorrow. It'll be available on our hub that Matt has shared at the top of the chat box. And so you can find that there. And then we will also work to create a FAQ with a lot of this information as well. We really thank Josh and Annie for partnering with us today and having all of these wonderful hospitality businesses on the call. Justin and Becky, we appreciate your time and all of the work that you've done to make this crisis a little less hard on our licensees during this time. So we are full of gratitude today.
Well, thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you. And if you have questions and something comes up and that you haven't thought of on the webinar today, I'd really encourage you to reach out to either Justin or I or to our customer service line. We're always willing and we're here to help.
Thank you, Becky. And with that, I will say goodbye to everyone and hope you have a great rest of your week.